Hello and welcome to today's webinar on Planting the Seeds of Change, Managing Social Issues in Land Investing. My name is Bettina Rainbott. I am Senior Manager of Social Issues in the ESG Engagements team here at PRI. And before we begin, I would just like to go over some basic housekeeping items. You can either connect your audio via the online system following the instructions shown on the screen, or alternatively dial in by phone using the dial-in details listed on your screen as well. These should be on your top right-hand side of your screen as outlined. We also want to make today's webinar quite interactive, so we will have a few poll questions throughout. When we open this, you will see the question on your right-hand side as well with multiple answers, and we'll let you know once we open those up. Also, we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so you can submit questions at any point during the webinar by using the Q&A panel in the webinar on the webinar platform. The questions will then be addressed by the speakers, and if you have any specific questions to specific panelists or speakers, please indicate that so we can direct them throughout. So, going on the topic of today, so protecting rights to land and resources and advancing sustainable investments are intricately related. Secure rights to property and resources support responsible investment in land. At the same time, responsible approaches to investments are necessary to ensure that legitimate tenure rights are respected. Investments in land-related economic activities often touch on a wide range of social, political, legal, and environmental issues that require careful consideration. So, for example, on the environmental side, there's a need to consider the consequences for the terrain and its biodiversity. On the social, which will be the focus area of today's webinar, we'll look at the impact of land-related activities on the rights of those who depend on the land for their existence. And from a governance perspective, there might often be potential conflicts and claims between companies and local communities. So advancing land rights are therefore a crucial step to ensure that investments have positive rather than negative impacts for local communities. Looking at the agricultural sector, for example, it's essential that this is sustainable and resilient to ensure food security for the rapidly growing population. So from a demographic point of view, it's quite key that investors also play a role in building the resilience. And as the bulk of agricultural production, over 70% of worldwide food production, is still overwhelmingly composed of smallholder farmers, institutional investors can play a role in ensuring that financial flows can reach the smallholder farmers so that agricultural production can increase, but in a way that doesn't provoke negative externalities or come at the cost of their rights or livelihoods. Today's webinar really aims to raise awareness about why investors should consider land issues and learn about also the reference guide for risk assessments in relation to land that a multi-stakeholder initiative have set up, which we'll hear more about in this webinar. So I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers. We'll have Anna Potts, who's Manager of Responsible Investment at APG Asset Management, and Karen van Boxtel, who's Officer of Policy Development and Sustainable Land Use at both ends. And I will start with providing an introduction to why APG as an investor is looking at this issue, and then also introduce the reference guides that I mentioned. We will then open up for a poll question to everyone online before handing over to Karen, who will then provide a local perspective from a civil society organization. After her presentation, we'll then open up for a Q&A and then also wrap up with an overview of what PRI does in this space and how signatories can engage on the topic. And my colleague Archie will outline our next steps on that role, who's Head of Private Markets at PRI. So before handing over to Anna, I would like to just start with one question for you all on the poll. So you'll see now on the right-hand side, we've opened the poll question, which is what regions do you invest in currently? And you can select all of the choices, or only some of them. It depends on what's applicable. And then the second question, which will also come up on the screen, is what are the most important social issues your organization faces when making an investment? So these could be labor issues, local communities, land rights, cultural rights, job creation, and economic development. So you'll just see the questions here as well on the slides, and then for you to click on the answers. While that's going on in the background, I thought I'd hand over to Anna, who is outlining why investors really care about this issue. So without much further ado, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. So, thank you for that introduction. My name is Anna Pot, and I work for APG Asset Management. APG Asset Management is an asset manager for pension funds in the Netherlands. And we serve the pensions for over 4.7 million beneficiaries. And the total amount of our assets under management is now around 474 billion euro. So as you can see here on this slide, this long piece of text is the mission that we as APG have set for our clients. And as you see in the last bullet is the message that I want to bring across here is that contributing to a sustainable world for future generations is an integral part of our investment processes, which means that responsible investment is really an inherent part of our investment policy. It's not a side activity or separate fund. It's really part of the way we invest. And that's also what you can see in our investment beliefs, is that taking into account social and environmental and governance aspects is really part of what of how we invest, as we believe this makes us better investment decisions. If we pay close attention to sustainability factors and responsible business practices, this gives us a more complete picture of the opportunities and risks, and therefore know our investments better. And if we, and with we I mean not only the responsible investment teams, but our investors, the portfolio managers who actually make the investment decisions, if we identify ESG issues with the companies we invest in, we discuss them with the companies, again, with the aim, with the purpose to improve the sustainability performance of our investments. The next slide, yeah. So as I said, information, knowing our companies that we invest in is key. It helps us to be a better investor and to know our companies better. And in order to collect that information, that research, we rely on a range of sources. Next to, of course, the information from the companies themselves and our research providers. So for instance, we work with Sustainalytics or MSCI ESG, but also information on Bloomberg or broker reports. These all are important sources to help us better understand the investment opportunities. But next to that, as you can see here, just an example of some of the sources that are also important for us to tap information from our civil society organizations, who bring us information, research, reports that we take into account. And next to that, I included this logo from the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, the CHRB, which is an initiative that APG contributes to develop better information, more information on the social performance of companies, particularly regarding their human rights. On this next slide, I wanted to bring up an example that showed us the importance of having access to these local sources, to have access to civil society, the information from civil society organizations locally. And in particular, in investments in real assets, we learned that this is important to have these local sources of expertise and guidance. So the example is about a forestry investment that has an FSC certification at the time that we invested in it, that started off as a really nice flagship investment, but in the end didn't perform as well as we had hoped to. The management of the company was not as effective as we had initially seemed, and we had questions on the governance structure of the fund. Also, the performance was not so good as we had hoped, and there were more and more reports about concerns from local communities. These people did not feel engaged, and there was a lack of clarity on the exact use of land in some cases. So as we always do in this situation, we engaged with the fund on needed improvements. However, what we have learned that our review and engagement became much more effective after we had established contact with local sources. In this case, we spoke with local partners of Oxfam, and the Dutch embassy experts brought us in contact with her local contacts. So one of the diligence trips from our investment teams, I joined in this trip to visit the forestry plantations. And during that trip, we met with local communities and with civil society groups in the area. And the local embassy staff also helped us to organize meetings with government representatives and local experts. And this all helped us deepen our understanding of the local context and the circumstances. And as a result of that, our review of the investment became much more comprehensive, and I want to highlight that, our engagement on specific asks became more effective. The information we received from the local community and institutions put us in a better position to ask for tangible improvements in the company. And this led eventually to actual measures be taken by the new management of the company. So, for instance, they improved their community engagement processes and practices and created better community programs. So some of the takeaways of this experience include the value of connecting with the local civil society organizations and the embassy staff to enrich our perspectives. I think another point that I want to highlight here is the importance of managing expectations in our interactions with these local partners. Obviously, they all have their own different agendas, and what we learned, we really should be clear on what our role is in such a dialogue. So, for instance, in meetings with local communities, people at times see you as being part of the company, so not as an investor, but really being part of the company. And they just want to have things arranged for them, you know, in their specific community. Also, these people do not speak with one voice. You know, there's not one voice on behalf of all communities. They all have their own interests. So you really have to keep this in mind as you listen to the various points of their view. Also, another point that I want to highlight in this context is that in our experience, these people in often cases do not want the company to leave. They see the value of the local economic activity and the jobs it brings. Where, in contrast, you know, some of the international campaign groups often want to see quick results and would call for divestment. Another point that we learned in this case is that local organizations are often understaffed or, so to say, less developed in their messaging. So it was really important for us to take enough time to really understand their concerns and recommendations. And then one last point about the government agencies that we've met. Obviously, they have at times other agendas that we needed to take into account. But in our experience, depending on whom we spoke with, there were very knowledgeable experts with very detailed information of value. So how we went about is that really at the start and at the end of each meeting, we made very clear what our position was and what one could and could not be expected from us. So we had very good conversations that were really of great value to us. So that brings me to the next slide about this initiative that we want to introduce to you. So following our experiences facing the importance of managing land issues well, we agreed to participate in an initiative that was started by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2014. It's called the Netherlands Land Dialogue. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative with the objective to contribute to the improvements of land governance in countries where Dutch companies are active. And as APG, we sit in this so-called organizing committee together with civil society organizations like Oxfam and both ends, together with the University of Utrecht, and also with financial institutions like the Rabobank, Axiom, and FMO. And through the programs and initiatives, the Land Dialogue shares best practices and really proposes tangible recommendations to institutions and companies, all again with the aim to improve land governance and avoid adverse impacts for local people. So examples of activities that the Land Dialogue has been engaging in is an initiative on working with infrastructure projects in developing countries. We've organized expert meetings, but we've also, the topic of today, published a reference guide. As you see on this page, on this slide, the front cover of this reference guide. What is it? So, referring to the example that I spoke about with this forestry investment in Mozambique, I hope we have established the value of intelligence about the local context and access to local experts. So I was looking for a database for local organizations and sources that could help us in next situations to identify the right people to talk with. But it was not there yet. Such a source was not available. So every time I needed to look in my address book and ask via who to contact in certain areas, that didn't seem to be effective. So conclusion is we needed to make such a reference guide. We developed this reference guide. You see on the bottom of the page the web link to the actual document where it's posted. We developed a reference guide together with people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who have access to local networks via their embassies, and also involved were people from civil society organizations with Oxfam and both ends, and again, the University of Utrecht. So what is it? What is the reference guide? The reference guide is a document that contains links. It links to local organizations and international organizations with local networks with their contact details. But it also contains an overview of available information on general land-related issues for specific sectors and regions. So as you see on this next slide, yes, there it is. This is the table of contents where you could see how the guide is structured. Again, the guide is what it says it is. It's a reference guide. It's structured for different areas where we have identified interest from investors and where there's issues that could be of concern, where one could find an overview of information on so country research with information on laws and regulatory considerations, and one could click then on the different sources that we refer to and recommend you to find more information on the local context via these local networks and local experts. So the value for us is really to have this information, this wealth of research that's out there among local sources and local organizations, to unlock that information to financial institutions like ours and yours to benefit from and to have an enriched assessment from the potential investments, but also to give the human rights defenders locally a voice to share with you local considerations and interests that could be of value, and eventually, as an outcome, have human rights better protected in their situations. So that brings me to a close of the introduction of APG, how we have gone about these issues and why we have contributed to this publication to unlock this local research, this local information to for better assessment of your investments. Thank you. I'll give the floor to you, Bettina.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for providing the overview and also the links to this resource. So as Anna mentioned, and we had it on the slide, the link to the resource, but it's also in the public domain, so you can all access it as well. Now, before we move on to hear from the local perspective and the civil society organization with Karen, we wanted to just launch another question, and we've opened it already, so this is the time for you to click either agree or not agree. And the question is, or the statement rather, is disclosing information about local land use rights and issues from local organizations will benefit our investment decisions and will lead to investments which are more in line with local community needs and aspirations. So the question is really an open-ended one, but it would be great to hear from you online whether you agree or not agree with this statement, and we can discuss this then going on in the Q&A following. So while this is going on in the background, and I hope you all can answer or click on it so that you don't have any technical issues, I'd like to hand over to Karen, who's speaking from both ends and providing the local perspective, as to say, from civil society organization. And without much further ado there either, I'd like to hand over the floor to you, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me. Thank you, PRIs, as well for organizing and facilitating this webinar. Also, Anna, thank you for your work in setting up the reference guide and organizing all this. I think this is a very valuable webinar in which a lot of perspectives come together. So to shortly introduce myself, my name is Karen van Boxtel. I work at Boxtel as a policy officer, sustainable land use, and I am specialized in land governance issues. So in my work, I collaborate with a network of local partner organizations of Boxtel on strengthening sustainable land use practices and land use rights of local communities. These partners with whom I work are civil society organizations, as Anna was referring to in her presentation, or they are grassroots organizations, so really community-based organizations in southern countries, which are closely linked to communities. Being a member of the organizing committee of the Dutch Land Dialogue, which was shortly introduced by Anna before, I aim to bring these concerns and ambitions of local partners to the table. One of the issues that has been on the table of land dialogue for many years has been the integration of local knowledge in the investment decisions of financial institutions. And although it was always on the table, it was also always a struggle to make this more concrete. And that's also the reason why I'm very pleased to hear that Anna took action to work on this issue and developed a reference guide, and that we have this webinar. And it's a good step forward in the challenge to bridge the knowledge gap between, on the one hand, the information on which it's currently used by financial institutions to assess investments, and on the other hand, the complexity of land use rights, which we see at local level. At the same time, I see strong challenges to really implement and use the guide, especially in an early phase of an investment. And I think this webinar is a perfect opportunity to look for opportunities and possibilities to overcome these barriers. I like to encourage all of you to collaboratively find ways and put the reference guide into practice. I think the discussion later on will provide opportunities for that as well. I will, after a short introduction, I will shortly talk about both ends, who we are, and further, and moving afterwards to reflection on the reference guide. I have some issues, some points to share with you, ending up with food for thought as a reflection and input for the discussion later on. So firstly, about both ends, who we are and how we work. We are a Dutch NGO based in Amsterdam, working on environmental sustainability and social justice issues. We work, although we're based in the Netherlands, we work in the south and with southern organizations. Our mission is to strengthen global civil society, so community-based organizations and civil society organizations, to gain decisive influence on the use of nature and the environment, and in this way contributing to societies that stay within our planetary boundaries and respect their human rights, including the rights to water, food, and a safe living environment. So as you can see from the infographic here, we put civil society at the forefront of our work. Civil society is actually the radar antenna for us on what's happening on the ground. We're at the heart of both ends work. And why? Because we believe that civil society organizations and community-based organizations are the ones working with local communities and know the most about the sustainable land use and natural resources management at a local level. They are the ones promoting community participation in the decision-making on land and water governance. And in this way, our local partners can signal where policies and investment infringe upon local communities' land and water use rights, and translating it in advocacy and lobby, or on the other hand, develop alternatives to strengthen the good practices which we see on the ground as well. To move on to the reflection on the reference guide. I want, in my reflections on the guide, and especially how to use the guide, how to implement it, I want to take you to northern Mozambique. It's a different case than Anna presented, but it illustrates very well what we see happening on the ground and in other areas as well. We became involved in the region through our partners who mentioned developments in LNG, in liquid natural gas investments and gas drilling, which involves, among others, 7,000 hectares in which communities are living. I will shortly share something with you about the context of this case, but especially we'll move on to the issues that we see happening there. Regarding the context in northern Mozambique, the offshore gas drilling and onshore liquid natural gas production and storage is happening in the northern province of Cabo Delgado. The onshore activities cover about 7,000 hectares of land, and the concession was given to the company from the Mozambican government. It involves resettlements in the area of the 7,000 hectares, and the land rights of the inhabitants are primarily customary or informal land use rights. So it's not, as is the case here in the Netherlands, that they have a paper which states what their rights of land to the land are and what area it concerns. And furthermore, the local partners in Mozambique with whom we work indicate that the aspirations of these local communities, their views, their perspectives on the future use of the land are not yet included in the plans of the LNG developments. Well, this whole case reflects actually one of the most important aims of both ends and our partners on the ground, and that is to have local aspirations, views, natural resource rights included in the divestment decisions made regarding their land. And not only after the investment decision is being made, but actually prior to that investment decision. This is not only the case in northern Mozambique, but also, for instance, in Jakarta and Manila. Having these local perspectives included is, I think, a win-win situation for many of us. In the following slide, I will highlight 4 issues which we see happening in northern Mozambique and illustrate the dynamics in many other projects as well. So here you can see a picture of a community meeting with companies in northern Mozambique. This community lives in the area of the concession. They are being consulted and informed by the companies as part of the environmental and social impact assessments. In northern Mozambique, there has been fact-finding missions as well by international financial institutions or foreign governments. But what we see happening there is that almost nobody establishes these community meetings, so having direct engagements with community meetings. As Anna mentioned as well, this is having these community meetings gives a picture of how things are working on the ground, and fully engaging with the community is therefore very crucial. What we hear from our local partners in northern Mozambique is that communities are not very much aware of the whole process and the impacts that the activities have on their lands, especially in the future. And their views are not yet resonated in the plan. Directly engaging with communities is therefore key in understanding these local dynamics and realities. And this is also established within the human rights framework, as for instance, free, prior and informed consent, and the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of land, fisheries and forests, the VGT, adopted by the World Committee on Food Security in 2012. So, yes, as a first point, community involvement as a crucial issue in implementing the reference guide. And next, as a second issue, I want to put forward concerns. I want to put forward the environment of tensions and threats in which communities in northern Mozambique live. In many local communities where land-based investments take place, tensions within a community may arise. There is new information, new actors coming in, different positions tend to affect communities' well-being. But at the same time, also community members who stand up for their rights are facing threats. The reference guide is also referring to environmental and human rights defenders, and this group of people are growing every day and are facing these severe threats. And if I may mention one example, the murder of Berta Cáceres a year ago is one of these examples in which threats and violence led to severe threats of human rights defenders. And another thing related to this is also because many communities who are not familiar in directly communicating with private sector actors, a relation of trust becomes a crucial issue within in CSOs and community-based organizations' work. So when implementing the reference guide and engaging with local communities, civil society organizations, or community-based organizations, having a relationship of trust and building this relationship of trust is very crucial, especially in this context. Thirdly, time and means. As we are aware of, the primary goal of civil society organizations and community-based organizations is to strengthen the rights of local communities, have their voices heard in decision-making processes, but also support local communities in these processes. They do this through lobby and advocacy, by brokering between communities and local authorities, also often involving private sector actors, investors, etc. Another part of the work of civil society organizations is the capacity development about the natural resource rights of these communities, and sometimes also combined with campaigning work. All this work together puts a quite heavy workload on the civil society organizations and community-based organizations with who Boxtel works. We see that they have limited time and means, are all over the place, have to deal with very urgent issues. And in contacting civil society organizations or community-based organizations for information on land issues in the region, it will also often imply for them to invest in time and means and gathering this information. This may in many cases put a huge burden on them. For example, in Mozambique, we see that many CSOs are based in Maputo, so the capital, which is quite far away from the north. And traveling to the north, to Cabo Delgado, regularly is time-consuming and very costly. And we see that this also affects the CSO landscape and the ability of civil society organizations to work there. So as a last issue, I want to touch upon the roles and independency. Civil society organizations and community-based organizations are independent organizations, and they cherish their independency. They value their ability to operate independently of interest from third parties and want to be fully engaged with local communities to defend their rights and interests. I share this with you because I think it's very important to see, to make clear what expectations we have towards each other. And as Anna was saying, a clear expectation setting and role division between the different actors and stakeholders in such a process is very important. So, as to wrap up, some food for thought. The central question for me now is how to put the reference guide into practice and how to not leave it with a paper tiger, but have a real value in improving the investments and the work that you are currently doing. So from all the thoughts that I shared with you, I think there are 5 aspects I want to highlight at this point. The first one, engaging with local communities themselves, find out their interests and aspirations. This is key to gathering the information and collecting the information on which you can base your investment decisions. Secondly, reflecting about which role every actor has and will play in these settings and how to guarantee independency for local community-based organizations and civil society organizations. Acknowledging these different roles also between the communities, the CSOs, investors, and governments is an aspect to reflect upon. Thirdly, I was sharing thoughts about the tensions, threats, a relation of trust, which is important. And one aspect which is crucial in this is the independent facilitation in these kind of processes. So to establish this relation of trust with local groups and local experts. I believe that having an independent party who is trusted by local communities but also by other parties is one of the preconditions to have this reference guide being implemented. Well, for instance, we are currently also working in Latin America with independent facilitators, mediators, and we see that it is quite, well, if the party is being trusted by local communities and local organizations, this is a very fruitful collaboration. Thirdly, financial remuneration. It's a tricky issue, I admit, but I think it's something that we should think about here during this webinar. We see that gathering local information and knowledge by local groups puts quite a heavy burden on them, and they actually don't have time and means to do this extra work. So I think it would be, I'm convinced that we should talk about how to overcome this obstacle and how to establish an independent mechanism which can ensure the remuneration of CSOs. For instance, Boxtel is working with small grant funds, which could be an independent mechanism which ensures that CSOs and CBOs get remuneration for their time and means. Lastly, part of the task for financial institutions is also to clarify what is being done with the local information. So how is this interpreted and how does it influence the investment decisions? Be clear about this towards local CSOs and CBOs. To have a clear understanding before the information is being exchanged. Also, the challenge remains to employ the local information well, to integrate it into investment procedures and to base investment decisions on it. So it also implies to have to gather local information prior to an investment decision is being taken. At the last point, I mentioned a pilot. I think putting this in practice is the biggest challenge, and having a pilot, establishing it, learning from the pilot is something that would improve the reference guide and its implementation. So thank you for listening. This was my presentation. I have my contact details on this slide, so let me know if you have any further questions. And I'm looking forward for the discussion session later on. But for now, there is another statement or question which I want to share with you. Namely, the institution where I work is willing to contribute to an independent small grant fund which will compensate local organizations for their time and resources spent on gathering local information on land use rights and ESG issues. So if you're a financial institution, would you be willing to contribute to a small grant fund?
Great, thank you very much, Karen. And as Karen mentioned, we have the poll open now for the second statement, looking at whether you agree or not, if you would be willing to contribute to the small grant. So we'll just keep that open as well, and actually now open up for Q&A. So as I mentioned earlier on as well, you can submit your questions in the little chat box. And if you have any specific questions to any of the speakers, please indicate that as well. Just to give you, while we're waiting for the poll to close, just to give you an update on the first poll when we looked at whether, the people online and the audience were agreeing with disclosing the information about local land use rights from the local organizations will actually benefit the investment decisions. From everyone who responded, a positive 100%, everyone agrees, so that's a good story to see. So it'll be interesting to also see what the audience and you online think about this question that Karen just posed. However, I just wanted to maybe open up to both Karen and Anna with two questions that have come in, and one that actually ties well into the point around the local communities, and having seen from the poll results actually that local communities is one of the biggest issues for investors who are currently listening in as one of their social issues. Well, it would be interesting to hear maybe from you, Karen, speaking about your point around community involvement and highlighting how crucial that is. Do you have any good practice examples of how this local engagement would look like? Any kind of clear examples we could showcase and share? Karen, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you for the question. Good question. I must say I don't have a full-fledged example that we experienced yet, but we have some smaller experiences on this. Well, what I think is important are a few steps. For instance, as the first one was to have a good practice in engaging with local communities is involves to have to contact to have a mapping of what actors are there in the community in the area. As a second step, what is also being said in the reference guide is to contact an NGO working there, an embassy working there who can help you with that information to dive a bit deeper in what's going on in the area. We have received, as docents, also some requests, some questions from financial institutions about a certain area in which an investment was going on, or a certain company. So what we do then is to link them with partners, with local partners with whom we are working. But then the difficulty really comes in that they do not have the time, not have the means to really invest their time in it and to really investigate what's going on in that specific area in, for instance, Cameroon. And I think that's the main obstacle. So I'm really thinking about an idea of a small grant mechanism, which would put that obstacle, which would remove that obstacle from the practice. And then, secondly, I think what we see as well is what we see happening in mediation procedures. That's not prior to an investment, but at a very later stage. Is that the party who is mediating, who is facilitating, it's so important to have a relationship of trust between that party who is facilitating and the local communities. That's something which is, yeah, just needs to be there. And the third issue which I want to highlight is that traveling to the area for several times is something which is very important. In fact, finding mission has to take some days, and visiting a community in one day is not enough. It has to be an engagement over a longer period of time. And I think these are some key issues which I hope help.
Great. Thank you very much. I've got another question which I think is probably directed to Anna. So do you find on balance that community engagement is done in a meaningful way, i.e. as a means of seeking to incorporate community input to company operations for investment decisions, or just as a means of trying to placate communities and push corporate agendas through? What are the consequences to these two approaches for you as investors? Big question.
Yeah. Hi, it's Anna here. Thank you for that question. I think that's a very valid point, and indeed a very important question to ask. You know, how are companies actually doing community engagement? Is it just a tick-the-box exercise, or are they really listening to the concerns and recommendations expressed by local communities? So I think that is the big challenge for us as an investor in, again, being clear about our role. We are investing funding in, money into these companies, and we rely on the information from the company to what extent community engagement has taken place or is effective indeed. So 2 points. Indeed, our observations and having had these having experience in this for 10 years, I think it's clear that there are indeed many companies who, really do a nice job. There are companies who don't do a community engagement at all, or there are companies who do community engagement, but in such a minimalistic way that it doesn't really add value. So for us, it is the challenge to ask the right questions. So it starts all with, asking the question, do you have such a program at all? And what have been the impact of these programs? What did it bring to you? And I think with this simple question and listening well to the answers, you can already see which companies need to improve in this respect. And is it going well? What's our observation? I think, as I said, it varies. There's certainly, I've certainly seen companies make huge improvements in this, and I've seen companies really doing a great job, and there are companies who still need to improve. So no need to get bored in this on this topic.
No, that's a really good point. Thank you for that. And just following up on that before we move on as well, just another question that came in. Do you find there is a focus on business risks during consultations on human rights risks? And do you think that these two different approaches have different consequences for investors? So again, not a small question, an open-ended one, but it'd be great to hear your reflections on that point.
Yeah, so that's obviously a question that comes back. How do these issues relate to the business risk of companies? So for us, the way we look at it, we are an investor. We want to know if our investments are at risk or if there's opportunities for our investments to improve. Again, we are serving for the beneficiaries of 4.7 million people to make sure that they have a pension when they retire. So our investments need to bring returns. So having said that, the way we look at our investments is really with this business lens. And if we see that companies are facing disruptions in their operations, are facing legal proceedings that delay the processes, that if we see that companies lose their reputation or their social license to operate, these are valid points that have an impact on our investments that we regard as risk, business risk to our investments, and that's a reason to have these conversations. I think there's enough examples out there of big infrastructure projects or pipeline companies or big plants being built where or big mining operations being established where it's obviously clear, also from this business risk perspective, that companies need to make sure that they also have their social license to operate and know what the local context is about and what the local interests tell them. So we don't, I see a clear overlap here.
Great, thank you. So in the interest of time, and we're wrapping up, we also wanted to give you an insight into what PRI is doing in this field. Before I hand over to Archie, we are opening another poll just to gauge a little bit of interest from you on two things, and you'll see that again on the side. How likely will you use this resource in your daily practices? And as Karen mentioned as well, it's very key to have this at the beginning of the investment decision making, so it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, and also at what part of your investment process do you see this resource fitting in. So feel free to complete those on the side, and now I'd like to hand over to Archie to give a quick overview of PRI's work and the Real Assets Work Plan 2018 to 2021.
Thank you, Bettina, and thank you, Anna and Karen, for some very thoughtful and insightful presentations. We have 3 minutes left, so I want to make sure you'll get on to your next meetings on time. So very quickly, for those interested in what PRI is doing in farmland and then in real assets more broadly, I'm just going to move the slides on here. We work out how to do that. Very quickly, how does PRI define real assets? They're physical assets, generally not financial securities, generally fixed assets, and the scope that we've included is essentially covering real estate or property, infrastructure, farmland, obviously, and then forestry and timber. We will not be including work on commodities, although they're technically real assets. They obviously play a very different role in most investors' portfolios. And really what we're doing, we're setting up the work plan that Bettina mentioned will run from the 1st of April this year for the next 3 years. We really want to encourage farmland and other real assets investors to engage in this program. I sit within the investment practices team, and our focus is really on outreach, industry awareness raising, and then educating investors on best practice in responsible investment. And we really focus on the process rather than the specific issues. So just quickly, this slide was aimed to highlight why we're looking at real assets now, and why we're focusing on these asset classes in particular. Investors are typically using these asset classes for diversification. They're using them for alternative sources of income, particularly to the bond market, where we've seen particularly low interest rates in recent years, and they're also using them to protect against inflation. And this slide shows, based on reporting that signatories do on an annual basis, what allocation our signatories have to real assets. So you've got both direct investments and indirect investments made via funds. The orange at the top of each bar shows funds that have more than 10% of their total assets under management allocated to those asset classes. And then the grey dots and the numbers next to those is the volume of assets invested in each of those. So you can see on the left-hand side, roughly $2.08 trillion US in real estate investments or property investments. And then on the right-hand side, you've got roughly combined between $34 billion in farmland investments. So a significant amount of the global market. And really, the reason we're doing this now is, one, because PRI has grown and we've been able to allocate more resource to some of the smaller asset classes relative to equities and bonds. There are clearly some major knowledge gaps that we would like to address with the help of our signatories and the industry as a whole. There's a lack of guidance on things like standards for sustainability in farmland practices, for obviously social issues that we've mentioned, and this is a great start to our work in this space. So we're very keen to fill some of those gaps and support knowledge sharing across the industry. I feel we're running out of time. I'm going to skip ahead to some of the main points here. In fact, I'm not even going to run through these slides. I'm just going to show my email address because I fear people will have to jump off onto other calls. Please do email me. The email is there at the bottom of the page, archie.beeching@unpri.org. This slide just shows the next steps that we're doing immediately this year, and then, as I mentioned, there's a 2-year plan beyond that. We'd love you to get involved. We have a monthly newsletter. There's a number of pieces of work you will be able to contribute to, so please do email me and I'll follow up with the full version of the work plan. Back to you, Bettina.
Great, thank you, and this was very short and sweet, so if you are interested to learn more about it, as Archie said, please do get in touch, and Archie's email is currently on the slide there. So conscious that we've run out of time, I just want to say thank you very much to both speakers and Archie for presenting, and also thank you to everyone online for joining in for today's webinar. And if you have any questions, any follow-up questions or anything, feel free to get in touch with Archie or myself at PRI. And on that note, I wish you all a lovely rest of the day and a lovely rest of the morning for those of you in the morning time zone. Thank you very much.